All right, so we're going to talk about defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms, a lot of the sort of crystallization of the thought around defense mechanisms actually comes from Anna Freud, not from Sigmund Freud. When he wrote about these things, she actually crystallized them and makes a list in 1936. She's doing this. By the way, Anna Freud, my academic grandmother, my doctoral supervisor, my first doctoral supervisor, studied with her at the Mininger Clinic, which back in the day, which is in Kansas, and back in the day was a center for psychodynamic stuff, and he studied under her. And so she's one of my academic grandmothers. Now, defense mechanisms appear singly or occur together. They're used unconsciously, basically to reduce anxiety. And there are three basic types of anxiety we can think about. Reality anxiety, which is a fear of a real danger in the external world. This is where this stuff evolved from, right? Because back in the day when we were living out in the savannah, our ancestors were living out in the savannah of Africa, real anxiety would be a signal of something. You'd see a lion in the distance, coming towards you, and you would get anxious, and that would cause you to go and run up a tree or do something to escape. So this is something that evolved, to help us survive, which is one of the reasons why we experience anxiety. Unfortunately, we have these big brains that can do all this imaginative stuff. So real world anxiety over time, because our brains evolving to be so complicated, becomes an imaginary. Anxiety can be triggered by imaginary things. You just imagine the lion coming at us and then feel anxiety. So we get something that we can call neurotic anxiety, which is a fear that originates in the ego that will not be able to control some unconscious impulse, eros and thanatos coming up, bubbling up to us, right? I think I mentioned this already a little bit. So all those impulses coming up, and they cause you to feel anxious. And then what happens is the ego can use a defense mechanism to put those things back down into the unconscious. Okay? And then the last one is moral anxiety, which is related to the fear of retribution from the superego or the conscience. And this superego or conscience can also be projected onto things in the outside world, such as authority figures, this kind of thing. If you have a job and you're always getting anxious when you're around your boss because unconsciously you think your boss is going to find out that you're not doing something right or give you some problem, that's a superego, that's a moral anxiety. And again, this is something you can see really quite readily if you look around society, people experience it. Especially moral anxiety, you definitely see this playing out in religion, right? A lot of religions use a lot of moral anxiety to I might say control people, but I might be a little bit biased. But they use moral anxiety to rein in the believers, right? Rein in their whatever they're doing, right? So you could think a good example, an extreme example would be like these Muslim Taliban people, which is kind of funny because they do a lot of things that we consider quite immoral, but their sense of morality is they see people doing things, women without the headscarf, whatever, they get moral anxiety and feel like they've got to go and control it, right? So this is something that I think is something in the world that is very problematic, personally. My personal belief is that's very problematic. But I don't want to go all existential on you here. I'll try to bug the dean when he comes to that class. Yes.
Would you consider Catholic guilt that?
Yes. Jewish guilt, Catholic guilt, Buddhist guilt. Yes. Yeah. You pick your religion. All religions have some amount of guilt. But really, the real thing to realize, it's coming from you. It's coming from us, right? That we're responding to the authority of the church or whatever it is by this thing. Oh, we're not doing things right. We're supposed to do this. We're not supposed to do that, right? And this is so. If I teach in the class on existentialism, I might mention that Sartre said he had no superego because he basically excised this from his own brain, realizing that this is something that I don't need to respond to, right? But you see this a lot with religion. I dare say nowadays we're seeing this in politics. This has now gone into our politics, which I think is unfortunate, not just in this country, but all around the world. So we can think about moral anxiety. I don't want to give you too much of my my biases about that, but just know that this is something that's a super ego thing. Now, obviously, this is good thing, right? Because you don't want people going around the feeling of guilt, or I shouldn't do something, or I know what's right and wrong. That's actually important, right? It's an important thing for us to have that, and obviously we have that because that also helped us back in the day to survive. And there's been a lot written about this. There's a lot written about morality and the evolution of morality. If you're interested, there's some very good literature on this. Some religious people will tell you that morality only comes from religion. I personally have a huge disagreement with that. And there's been enough work by evolutionary biologists and primatologists to show that morality has some bestows some fitness, right? So it's very important. But anyway, this is interesting. All right, so basically what we're going to talk about is the ego forms mostly, kind of overlaps a little bit here. But again, these defense mechanisms that are used by the ego, right? These are the standard ones that we typically and these are the ones you're going to see in therapy. Though you will see moral anxiety in the therapy because your patients are going to think that you have some sort of judgment about them, that you are you're the authority figure standing in judgment of them. And so they're going to have some of this, and that's something that's good grist for the mill to work through. Physicians have a lot of this. They inspire a lot of moral anxiety. Anybody ever gone to the doctor and you were supposed to do something like, oh yeah, you're not supposed to eat something or whatever, but you didn't really follow through, and now you got your doctor's appointment, you go in feeling a little anxious. I'll admit to that, right? That's kind of a moral anxiety. Okay. All right. So Freud defined anxiety as an intense feeling of nervousness, tension, and worry that are due to unacceptable impulses. These impulses get closer and closer to conscious, or become so overwhelming that they can't be held in check. And the anxiety functions as signal that the equilibrium of the system is off. Right? And it's a nice quote from Freud. I'll let you guys read that. Defense mechanism. So Freud wrote about anxiety in dreams. The dream occasionally awakens the sleeper to the accompaniment of the generation of anxiety. I dreamed about this class last night. A good example. It's no contradiction of this function, but rather perhaps a signal that the watchman regards the situation as too dangerous and no longer feels able to control it. So I had my dream last night about this class. Underlying that is my anxiety that I'm not going to be able to get through all the stuff I need to get through this class. Things are just going to fall apart, and I get bad evaluations. The dean's not going to like me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. Pull this up in my head. Hang on. And you guys can read the comic of the Anxiety Dream Academy there yourself. Okay. Now, Jerome Blackman, who I know, named 101 types of defenses, including repression, denial, reaction formation, splitting, radicalization, displacement, externalization, internalization, undoing, regression, et cetera, 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 et cetera. And in this book, he outlines 101 of them, but there are, of course, literally thousands. Almost anything can be a defense mechanism. Right? Very good book. And somebody's supposed to remind me that I'm going to print off a page of this book of the defense mechanisms found in personality disorders. So somebody remind me again. It's sitting on my table at home. It's waiting for me to scan the page in, so I will do that. So it's reminding me. Jerry's an interesting guy. He's also made a study of child sexual predators. Expert on this, he's a psychoanalyst, also a psychiatrist, and he has another book on that as a side note, which is really fantastic. And I used a lot of his work when I do my forensic consulting. So I quote a lot from him and talk about his stuff. He's somebody who goes out on a limb a little bit and says at some point these people with these child sadistic impulses or behaviors are really not good. This is a little controversial, right? Now, when I talk to law enforcement people and I tell them some, person over here, who thinks that, everybody has a Rousseauian view of the world, that everybody basically underneath everything is a good person, and you can fix these people, you can find them. It's just not, it's been fooled by them. right? These kind of psychopathic, antisocial personality sort of people have fooled them, right? And there's the ways in which they get fooled, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But actually, at some level, these guys are not curable. And Jerry has literally seen thousands of these people. He's done forensic assessment for literally thousands of these forensic assessments. And so this is his opinion. And I really follow along with this idea. And then when I talk to law enforcement people, they all are nodding their head, And I told them, the heavy lifting is going to be on you guys, because these guys are not going to, maybe if they're in prison and they're getting therapy, that's great. But, getting some therapy on the outside and then hoping that these behaviors are going to change, and sadistic behaviors toward children are going to change is unrealistic. Yes, you had a question?
Yes, I'm kind of reading ahead now and answering my question. I was going to ask, defense mechanisms are in the ego, they are partly conscious.
Yes, they can be. Some are more conscious than others. So that's a very, very good question. Ego and a superego. So just keep the superego sort of on the side there. But yes, ego and the superego. Some you can be very conscious of, right? So in other words, I'm leaving for class. I had my anxiety dream last night. I'm using myself as an example. I had my anxiety dream last night about this class. I'm leaving to come to class. Where are my keys? Can't find them. Can't find them. Can't find them. I misplaced them because I'm anxious about coming here, right? And then I realized, I'm anxious about the class. I'm anxious about getting the material. I've misplaced my keys. I can bring that to consciousness pretty easy, right? That's just like a little repression, right? A little reminder repression. I can bring that to consciousness. However, if I'm doing a splitting defense, which again, you'll see a lot in borderline personality disorder, most of the time, at least the borderline patients that I saw, no conscious understanding of what they're doing, right? Like I would say to my patient, it's interesting that, last time you were saying I was the best therapist in the world and you were singing my praises, and today you think I'm a piece of shit, what about last time? She'd look at me and say, I never said those things, right? Completely dissociated, right? So different defense mechanisms, the higher level defense mechanisms more easily brought to conscious, the more primitive ones, not so much. Okay, that's the one way you can think about it. Okay? And I debated whether to talk about this first or talk about developmental levels first, personality organization levels first. Say tomato, I say tomato. They kind of both go together. Okay? So I'll be talking about both those things before I'll talk a little bit about developmental levels before I get to we actually talk about them. I'll talk about them here later. Okay? So again, us, and I'm assuming everybody here is sort of neurotic personality organization level. People without overt which I mean by way I mean people without overt psychopathology. We use defense mechanisms like humor, where the expression of uncomfortable thoughts and feelings is made easier by making it funny, right? The whole comedian thing is based on this. That's what comedians are very good at doing. Suppression, which is a conscious forgetting or putting something out of mind, like my keys. And perhaps a healthy defense mechanism, sublimation, which is channeling our unacceptable impulses into something acceptable. And for Freud, who wrote this wonderful book, Civilization and Discontents, which I highly recommend everybody read, this is where civilization comes from. That we are able to take our, rather than fornicating and trying to kill each other in this room. Instead, we've sublimated all that, and we're doing something that is going to be constructive and good for the world. For you guys, that means becoming psychologists, but it could be making buildings and forming governments. It could be making sure we have a good road system. Anything that that we see as something as an aspect of civilization, right? And what you see out in the world, and again, it's a little my bias here, is that when the civilization, when the sublimation sort of breaks down in a society, what you see is that all these other things start coming to the fore, right? So you see in war-torn societies, for instance, what are the aspects of war-torn societies, right? Killing, obviously, and rape, by the way. Rape is a concomitant with war quite often, if not most of the time. Right. And this is also a primate behavior, by the way. I have a whole lecture about that, which I'm going to give you now. But you see, this sort of sublimation is like this thin veneer. Civilization is like this thin veneer. And when the sublimation breaks down, the impulses start coming out, right? So this is a very, very important defense mechanism, sort of as a whole for all of us, sort of, as a group. Now, Freud says about this, however, because remember he was writing this time, it's just later in his life, and he had jaw cancer. He's pretty miserable at this point. So he says that the bad news about sublimation is that because we're sublimating all the time, that we never get to fulfill our impulses. And so even though we're in these wonderful civilizations and we make these beautiful buildings and have these wonderful governments and these kind of things, we are miserable as individuals, right? Because we can never really fully satisfy our impulses. So there's the flip side to it. Okay? Yeah, very good book. I highly recommend it. If we were doing a class just on psychoanalysis, I might have you guys read this, but it's very readable, it's short, very readable, very applicable to modern world, in my opinion. Okay, so higher level defense mechanisms, intellectualization, using intellectual processes to avoid the experience of emotions. You guys are all doctoral students, so I'm guessing every single one of you does this to some degree because you wouldn't be here otherwise. You wouldn't be able to tolerate being a doctoral student unless you took the intellectualization. Displacement, which is shifting an unacceptable feeling toward one person on another. You know what this is? Like, let's say your boss really pisses you off, at work, like they do something you just really piss them, but you can't express that to your boss. That makes you anxious. So what you do is you go home and you're all pissy to your roommate, right? That's displacement. Reaction formation, where the unacceptable feeling is transformed into the opposite. This is really interesting to see this a lot, right? This is where, like, let's say you were really sexually attracted to somebody, but then, people ask you about that person, you go, oh, that person's terrible. I can't stand them. Oh God, it's horrible. Like that's a reaction formation, and vice versa, right? Somebody is super mean to you, and and you're just like, oh, you're so wonderful. You treat them like they're just this wonderful person. Reaction formation. Yeah, you see this a lot. This will come up a lot in therapy. More primitive defenses used by people with personality disorders, including splitting, which I already talked about that. Projection, which is the placement of feelings on somebody else, but put your own feelings onto somebody else, and goes along with projective identification, where you get the other person to act as if those feelings that were projected on them are actually their own feelings. And then dissociation, where a person separates themselves from an experience. And again, we'll talk more about the splitting one. That's very common, and we'll talk about some of these a little bit later on as well. But different level of defenses, and again, I'm presaging the lecture on levels of personality organization. Primitive ones: denial, regression, acting out, dissociation, compartmentalization, projection, reaction formation. Less primitive: repression, displacement, intellectualization, rationalization, undoing. We all probably do with these, and then more mature ones, sort of ones that we do when we're self-actualized. Sublimation, which is first talked about, self-assertion, suppression, compensation. I'm going to talk about compensation in regards to narcissism a little bit later. I'm talking about something that I call compensatory narcissism, which is a little bit my own idea, taken from the psychoanalytic stuff, but I've kind of crystallized it into my own ideas. So we'll talk about that. Altruism, anticipation, affiliation, self-observation, reflection, or now the modern word for this is mentalizing, the ability to mentalize, which also includes some reflecting on yourself, but also empathy toward other people, put yourself in somebody else's shoes, right? Yes.
So would the point be that all altruism is a form of defense mechanism, or some altruism is and some altruism becomes?
I think people argue about this, right? I'm going to say a little bit of both. I'll take the weasel way out and say I think it's a little bit. You can make case for both. Some is. So a lot of evolutionary biologists talk about the evolution of altruism, and what happens is, to make a complicated story short, is that the idea of altruism is that that the DNA of the species is looking out for itself rather than the individual DNA is looking out for itself. And evolutionary biologists fall into one or two camps. Most of them are in the selfish gene camp, that it's your own DNA that's trying to trying to look out for itself. But the other people will say, no, there's instances where, people get together and they do something altruistic for somebody without any direct benefit to themselves. It wouldn't benefit their own genes, but would help the other person. And that helps maybe the society as a whole. And that's something that is involved. So there's been debate in the evolutionary biology community about this. There's a little, I think my understanding, and I'm not up on the latest with this, my understanding is there's a little bit more acceptance of this idea of, altruistic behavior, that helps the group. But the selfish gene people will say, well, you're helping the group, but that ends up indirectly helping you. And so it's still a selfish gene kind of a thing, that you're not altruistic unless the person, that you're being altruistic is somehow really to some degree it enhances your fitness or is related to you. And so one of the people that I knew from UC Santa Cruz, Robert Trivers, a very famous evolutionary biologist, talked a lot about this. And he has in one of his books, he has a debate about this. It's a little dated now, but I mean, it's still pretty accurate. And what he did is he did a bunch of studies, kinship studies, right? And you can see that the amount of altruism sort of goes down, or as the person becomes further and further less related to you. And he actually looked in the animal kingdom, and he found this with various animals and insects and things like this. So it's something you see across the animal kingdom. And so, but then there are other people who will find exceptions to that, right? And so it becomes a debate. So I would say, as a psychologist, we'll just, you always want to suspect a defense mechanism, right? Because anything can really be a defense mechanism. So, in your practice, you can suspect it as, and when you see some altruism in your practice, somebody's being altruistic, but they've got other things they've came in for, other issues, then I think you can safely suspect it as a defense mechanism. And then you can be pleasantly surprised if it's not. But I'm going to tell you, most of the time, for the people that we're going to be seeing, it's going to be defense mechanism. But out in the wild, maybe not. Okay, maybe there is some real true altruism. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, it's we could talk about this all hour. It's an interesting debate. But you're not getting PhDs in biology, you're getting PhDs in psychology. So we'll stick to the defense mechanisms. And here's another way you can look at it. So these are personality organizations: psychotic personality organization, borderline personality organization, neurotic personality organization, and this one is, I think this is integrated personality. This is normal. Right? These are also in the normal range, I would say. A lot of these are in the normal range. Okay, and again, primitive things here. Defense mechanisms, denial, primitive denial. There's also more like mature denial. Omnipotent control. You see this in psychotic people. And if you read my book, we talk a lot of some case histories of this stuff. Talk about this. Evaluation. Talk about some of that. Borderline personality. We talked about mature stuff. Repression, isolation of affect, rationalization, intellectualization, these kind of things, right? And notice superego, immature. This level of the superego is starting to become integrated, and here the superego is integrated. Reality testing, very poor. Reality testing, I would say a little bit better, but not great. Narcissistic personality sort of reality testing is a little bit better. These guys are much better at reality testing. And then with normal people, wait a minute, I'm sorry. I meant to say borderline personality disorder organization. Narcissistic personality organization, not neurotic, narcissistic. Sorry about that. And then this is neurotic, which means normal in Freudian language. Okay? Identity diffusion. So this is from your book, right? Psychotic people, a lot of identity diffusion, identity fragmentation. Borderline personality disorder, a lot of identity. Personality organization, a lot of identity diffusion. Narcissistic personality organization, actually identity is pretty good. They have a pretty good sense of who they are because their identity is crystallized around this narcissistic self. And we're going to talk about more of that in detail. So they have a better sense of identity because it's crystallized around this narcissistic self image. Okay? And then regular people, all of us, using a good sense of identity. Rigidity, very rigid in a way, very rigid. I would say pretty rigid here, and then we're normal people, flexible, adaptable, So the $800 gorilla in the corner of the psychotherapy world. I just talked to somebody about this last night. My friend who's an acupuncture doctor, we're talking about seeing patients and people seeing them. And I said to him, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is that when you become a therapist, you get a sense of these things when somebody comes to see you. And what a lot of therapists do is they just say, let's get rid of all these. I don't want to see these people. I just want to see here. Because flexible, adaptable, good sense of identity, their reality testing's intact, good superego, mature defense mechanisms. I can work with these people. They're going to make really great progress in therapy. They're going to be really enjoyable to work with. I'm going to have a sense of accomplishment as a therapist working with these folks because they're going to get better, right? And all the research says they're going to get better. Doesn't matter what kind of therapy you're doing. All the research says these people are going to get better in therapy. They're going to be a joy to work with. They're going to be able to pay for therapy. They're going to be less likely to sue you. So what happens is these folks here all get referred off to somebody else, right? In this country, psychotic people just get drugs. Very little therapy is done with them. There's few people who do it. My dad's one of them. My supervisor is one of them. But in Europe, you see more therapy for people with psychotic disorders. I think this is starting to become, at least therapy as an adjunct to medication, is starting to become a little more popular now, which is good. But these people basically just going to be mostly medicated, right? These folks in between, the narcissistic people and the narcissistic personality disorganization, borderline personality disorganization, these are the ones that, like, a lot of therapists will try to just refer them out to somebody else because they're more difficult. So that's sort of, this is a nice graph or chart. I can mention that to you guys. Doesn't mean that you're a bad therapist because you just want to see these people. Okay? Because these people are very difficult to work with. Okay, and again, you can read some of these things, defense mechanisms. I'll let you guys read these. And I'm sure most of you guys have seen these before, listed these before in your undergrad classes. Again, more of the same things. This just breaks it down by personality disorder. Splitting projective orientation for borderline. Paranoid personality disorder, they do a lot of projection. Schizoid does a lot of withdrawal. This is the main thing. And a lot of living in the fantasy world. By the way, fantasy and living in fantasy world, not being able to distinguish fantasies from reality is a big red flag for anybody you're going to see if how much they live in their fantasy world. Big red flag. Histrionic people dissociate a lot. Obsessive compulsive people isolate a lot. Again, let you guys read through these. Now, defense mechanisms can also form as a form of resistance. Resistance is something that works against therapy, right? Defense can be used to blunt therapeutic insight and sabotage the working through the process of therapy. Okay? And you'll see this sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes. Okay? Defense mechanisms working with resistances are typically related to transference and countertransference, as well as the real-world aspects of the patient's relationship with the psychoanalyst or psychotherapist. Good example of defense mechanism is this flight and health. Did I talk to you guys about this already? Flight and health. This is where somebody comes into your office and they have some problems and they're really, really messed up. They come to see you 2 times and then they don't show up again, and you call them up and say, why didn't you show up? And they say, oh, I'm better now, completely well. Right? That's the flight and health. Yes.
I don't think my experience has been unique, but I encountered it a lot during the screens.
Mm-hmm.
People will talk about how bad things are, how stressed they are, and then they'll come to the measures and they're like, nope, I'm good. I don't have any anxiety, I don't have any depression. Like, literally just talking about this for like 20 minutes.
Yep. That's exactly right. Yeah. It's a defense mechanism, right? So one thing, this is something that happens a lot with new therapists, that they don't wait for this therapeutic alliance to really gel before they start getting into the real issues with somebody. And so what happens is the flight into health or people not showing up will be more prevalent, right? So I've seen this a lot with newer therapists. And this is something hopefully your supervisors will be on you about, right? That, have you really established the alliance, and the alliance really gelled to the point where this person is experiencing the flight into health, but rather than just blowing off the appointment, they actually show up and tell you oh, I'm all better now, right? In the office, I mean, you can deal with it, right? And see what's going on and explore it. That means your therapeutic alliance has been established to some degree, where the person actually will come in. If it's not established, they just won't show up, right? And that's the typical thing you see, the screening thing. You know, in other words, what people are doing is they're doing a little return on investment in their own minds. Their unconscious is doing this thing. Oh, it looks like this cure is going to be worse than the disease, right? Like I'm going to have to go through and open up and deal with all this unconscious crap that's coming up, and yikes, you know, that's too scary. So I'm just going to be better, right? You know, and so this is something. Now I might make a rather controversial statement and say there are probably therapies that use this, that claim that people are got better, but what's really happened is they've had a flight into health. And again, I'll go back to what I was telling you about catharsis, right? That if you have a good catharsis, you can easily make that into a defense that, oh, now I'm better, you know, let it all out, I'm better, right? And I don't need to go back and see the doctor anymore, right? So, and again, I don't want to pick on the humanistic therapies, but I do think you could kind of pick on them a little bit about this, okay? In other words, I do primal scream therapy, I go to the top of the hill, I scream at the top of my lungs for half an hour, and guess what? I'm better now, so see you later, right? You know, are you really better? Or you just have a catharsis and now you've defended against actually having to get into your real issues? I'm a little wary of that, right? And having lived on a commune, I lived on a commune when I was younger. The primal scream people would come, and other humanistic therapists would come and do group workshops on the weekend there. And it's interesting because you'd see the same people coming back for the workshops time after time after they'd been supposedly cured by, you know, screaming at the top of the hill, but they would come back a month later, you know, or the Gestalt people would have some very cathartic kind of form of therapy, and then they'd be all better. But, you know, 2 months later, they'd be back again in the group, same issues coming up, you know. So I became very jaded about catharsis in humanistic therapies. I really should write a paper on it. I'm sure it'll piss a bunch of people off. Albert Ellis, you guys know Albert Ellis, right? Because he's one of the founders of CBT. He wrote a paper entitled, back in the day, entitled "Why Transpersonal Psychology is Shit." That was literally the title of the paper. And again, some of these things I'm telling you, I think he was you know, commenting on. But I don't want to pick on humanistic psychology. I do like a lot of humanistic therapy. I just think, you know, you've got to be a little, you can't be too Pollyannish about what you're seeing. You got to, you know, it takes a little more depth. All right. Okay. That's all I want to say about those. We're going to go through these very quickly today. Any questions about defense mechanisms? Good. Pretty straightforward, right? I mean, let's talk about developmental psychology a little bit. I don't want to do it on here. Do I? I don't want to do it on here. That's levels. Okay. I'm not, this isn't too boring, is it? This is too remedial for you guys? This is interesting enough? Okay. All right. Let's talk about developmental levels. And of course, you know, I assume most of you guys have had a class in developmental psychology at the undergrad level. So this is going to be pretty review stuff. We're going to focus on the things that are important for therapy, the psychodynamic stuff, but you know, there's lots of different developmental psychologies. There's Piaget's development, there's moral development, Kohlberg and Gillian, what's the name of that one? You know what I'm talking about, right? And then there's you know, Freud's developmental stages and Eric Erickson's. Those are the ones we're going to focus on. But these have been around for a long time. People have had insights into developmental stages for a long time. And I have this wonderful quote from Shakespeare here, which is in the play As You Like It, which I actually saw a year ago here at Cal Lutheran, the main campus. They did it outside, and they did this soliloquy here. It was very beautiful. All the world's stage, all the men and women, young players. They have their exits and entrances. And one man in his time plays many parts. His acts being 7 ages. The first is infant, kneeling and puking in the nurse's arm. Then the whining schoolboy with the satchel and the shiny morning face creeping like a snail, unwilling to school. Then the lover, sighing like a furnace, with a woeful ballad made to his mistress' eyebrow. Then a soldier, full of strange oaths and bearded like a bard, jealous in honor, suddenly quickened quarrel, seeking the bubble reputation of narcissism right there. Even in the cannon's mouth, and then justice, in the fair round belly, with a good cape on, that's a chicken, line, his eyes severe and the beard a formal cut, full of wise saws and modern instances, and so he plays his part. 6 age shifts and balloon and slippered pantaloon, his spectacles on the nose and pouch on the side, his youthful hose well saved, the world too wide, for his strong strength and his big manly voice turning toward the child's treble pipes. And whistles his sound, the last tune of all, is in the strange eventful history, his second child persists and mere oblivion, sans teeth, sans eyes, sans tape, sans everything. All right, so describing the ages of developmental stages that we go through, all right? And again, you could probably look in Eastern cultures and, other traditional things and find similar kinds of descriptions of these things. There's one in Hinduism, which I should have brought in for you guys. It's really quite interesting. So these are not like strange ideas, right? These are pretty typical kinds of things. All right. Yeah. One second. All right. So Freud was one of the first to describe sort of the psychological version of these things. And in his works, 3 essays on the theory of sexuality and the infantile genital organization and introductory lecture from psychoanalysis, he really outlines these developmental levels. And he explains that these developmental levels are fueled by the eros, the sexual drive, the pleasure drive, right? And we can think of there's really 5 of these that Freud really talked about. Freud really talked about 4: oral, the anal, phallic, and the genital stage. Freud didn't name the latent stage because this is kind of a pause. You can even put that in there later, right? Younger Freud, by the way, he was a young man at one point. Here they are. You've heard these. Oral stage 0 through 2, infant achieves gratification to oral activities, feeding, thumb sucking, dabbling. Anal, child learns to respond to some demands of society, such as bowel and bladder control. That's 2, 3 to 7. Phallic, child learns to realize the difference between male and female, becomes aware of sexuality in a broad sense. And also, during this period, this is when the Oedipal complex starts up, right? So you can all think of their position in the world vis-a-vis rivals finding their place in the dominance hierarchy. If you want to take my take on it. Latency 7 to 11, child continues its development, but sexual urges are relatively quiet. And this is a part in childhood where the kids really learn that the technology of their society, their culture. So if the kid's raised in the Amazon along the river in an Indian tribe, they will learn how to do a bow and arrow and to, find animals and plants to eat, and, all the kind of things in their tribe. In our culture, kids this age, suddenly become very good at computers, right? And, this is where they becomes native to them, right? So whatever culture they're in, this is where a lot of learning takes place. This would be in the early school years. Okay, so a lot of the culture, the technology is transferred at this time. And then from 11 to an adult, this is the genital stage. Growing adolescent shakes off old dependencies and learns to deal maturely with the opposite sex. And again, you're going to see a lot of bias in the psychoanalytic writing, especially the old stuff. The proper sexual partner, the proper sexual target is going to be somebody of the opposite sex. I would take, anytime you see these kind of things in psychoanalytic thought, take it with a grain of salt, because it doesn't really mean that, every normal person has to have a heterosexual relationship. Okay. And there's been a lot of progress in the last, I would say, 20 years to try to not stigmatize other sexual preferences as much. But like I said, there's lots of heterosexual stuff that is pathological. Likewise, there's a lot of homosexual stuff that's pathological, right? Doesn't mean that all homosexual stuff is pathological. Doesn't mean that all heterosexual stuff is pathological. But you have to admit that anytime there's sex involved in anything, that there can be pathology, right? Again, when you go into practice, you can see this up and down all over the place. And that goes for every flavor of sexuality: bisexual, pansexual, non-sexual, asexual, incels, whatever you want to, everything, right, can have a pathological basis to it, okay? And one of our jobs is to find if that stuff is pathological or not. But we also have to be able to admit when it's not pathological. In other words, you have a gay client, and they come in here for some issues, but the issues aren't related to their sexual preferences, right? You need to be able to discern that. If that's part of the problem or not. And if it's not part of the problem, be able to accept that. Older psychoanalytic stuff, that was not accepted. That homosexuality was considered to be a pathology. All of it was considered to be a pathology. And to my mind, kind of swept under the rug how much of the heterosexual stuff is pathological, right? So if you're really, really dystopian or misanthropic, like I can be sometimes if I haven't had my coffee in the morning, I would say all sexuality, doesn't matter what kind it is, all of it's pathological. That's not a bad day, I would say that, right? But you have to be able to discern what is playing out here, if something is important or not. Okay, regardless of sexuality, anything. That's not the issue. This is a gay person coming to see me, but their gayness is not the core of the issue here. Something else is going on, right? Yes.
I was not clear, but you said that all like sexual urges are pathological.
I said if I had a really no coffee morning and I was really, really misanthropic, you know what that word means? Just like hating all humanity that day, I might say all sexuality is pathological. But I wouldn't say that. I would say some is and some isn't, right? Or put it this way, somebody comes to see you, what you're going to be doing when you're doing your therapy with somebody is you are ascertaining what is the main issue to be dealt with. Maybe they're having some sexual issues, but you ascertain that really what's going on is that the reason they're having the sexual issues is because they're depressed, and I'm going to work on the depression. I don't need to work directly with the sexual issues. The depression is really the key thing, and you're going to work on that, right? That's what I mean. But I want to be really careful here because it's very easy to pathologize people who are out of the mainstream of what our society sort of accepts. It and psychoanalysis has been very white bread, middle class, unconscious mores, unconscious moral values since the beginning that are not really examined. And I think as psychologists, our job is to examine these. I think we wherever we feel personally is fine. But I mean, when we're with our clients, to put those mores and those things aside and then examine people, just as people, but not making moral judgments. Obviously, there's a line in the sand, right? There's a line in the sand where you have to report people, and you're having sex with a kid, you're getting reported and going to jail. We have a line in the sand in our society. The laws and psychology clearly spell out where this line is. It fairly clearly spell out where this line is. So that otherwise, I think that level, stepping back from that, I think we need to, approach our patient, with an openness, right? I think that's part of our job, Yes.
So from that point of view, and lack of sexual behavior also.
Yes. Yes. Too much and too little. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And we're seeing that now, these incel guys, you guys have heard about them. I wanted to do, I told my other class this, I wanted to do a workshop and bring these guys out into the woods and work with them in big group therapy marathon thing and help them. I think I could do that. Thought about this. But yeah, but also too much. People who are hypersexual, right? It's the same, they also have problems, right? Yes.
What about not exactly like lack of sexual activity, but like asexuality? So like a lack of sexual interest.
So, again, the person's coming to see you. Is that the main issue that's driving whatever problems they have, or is that just their own personal choice? Mm-hmm. Right. So again, I'm gonna inject a little existentialism in here, that people make personal choices, right? So are those personal choices coming from a good place, or are they coming from something? Are they stemming from their pathology? That's our job. We're kind of detectives. Right, that's our job to figure that out when somebody comes in, right? And maybe you don't figure it out right away. Maybe it takes a little while to uncover it, right? And maybe the person comes and sees you for depression. They're talking to you for a year, and then at the end of the year, they go, like my depression feels better, but you know, I'm really worried about my sexuality, you know, okay, now we can shift and work on that, right? So I guess I'm pleading here for an open mind. And I'm also admitting here that psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic thought has had in the past this very white bread, heterosexual, cisgendered bias that I think has been fairly unconscious and unquestioned. Certainly in my dad's generation, that was really, you know, that was really true. But I think we have to be very careful about that. Okay, maybe a little bit more open to that. On the other hand, we don't want to go completely the other way and say, oh, well, all this heterosexual stuff is like that's pathological, and you know, being cisgendered is pathological. No, you know, it could be, and it could not be, just like any kind of sexuality. So I want to really make that point because this is something that's a little controversial, and you will hear people arguing back and forth about this. All right, oral phase. Starts at birth, lasts the first 18 months or so of life. And by the way, these time periods, you'll see different people giving different time periods. They're shifting. There's a bit of individual variation here in this, okay? Carl Abram, who was one of the original psychoanalysts back in the day, subdivided the phase into two periods: oral erotic and oral aggressive. Any mothers who nurse their children will have experienced these things. You know, the kids sucking and getting milk, and they're very happy, and the kids getting a lot of pleasure from feeding. And then the kid will suck on the breast, but nothing comes out, and the kid gets frustrated, and what does it do? They bite, right? That's the aggressive part. And mothers will tell you this is very typical. You can use some picture examples here. And then eventually at the end of this, the baby will start sensing what is we call ambivalence. That is, they will see this mothering person as both good, hopefully mostly good, and a little bit frustrated, right? Not providing, you know, instantly providing the baby who feels omnipotent with, you know, the pleasurable feelings all the time. That's where they start getting the sense of an other. The mother is this other person, right? This is the sense of ambivalence, which is very important. You want the ambivalence to mostly be good with a little bit of not perfect, right? Now, in kids who grow up and have personality disorders, the ambivalence will be mostly aggressive and bad with a little bit of good. Or if it's all bad, then that's also not good, right? So you want this ambivalence to be mostly good. We're going to talk about this later when we're talking about object relations. Because this is sort of the object relations era of development. This is where the object relation stuff starts. Okay? Okay, so Freud described how fixation in the oral phase can take place when the infant's oral needs are not satisfied or met accessibly. And he connected this to adults' nail biting, smoking, excessive drinking, chewing gum as such fixation. In other words, that the oral stage doesn't get successfully traversed. There's still some unresolved stuff going on there, and then this carries over to adulthood and shows up in certain sort of behaviors. And we also might think of certain sort of thought patterns as well. Okay. Later, psychoanalytic conditions link other psychological conditions, addictions, depression, dependency, extreme generosity, extreme optimism, oral phase fixations. We're going to talk a lot about object relation stuff with regard to personality disorders, and these have their genesis in this oral phase as well. We'll talk more about that later. Carl Menninger described how oral eroticization of the analysis becomes observable. Some patients, every word of the analysis is a pearl. For others, their own words are spoken as if they're minty gold with their lips, right? So again, you can think of the analyst or the therapist when they talk, you know, it's like breast milk for the baby, right? And likewise, you'll see the positive transference will be the words are like these, you know, wonderful, nourishing breast milk. And the negative transference will be the, you know, they're not saying what I want to you'll see the patient have the negative transference, and that's sort of oral aggressiveness. Smoking and drinking. By the way, if you want to see oral phase fixation stuff in its raw form, just go to Las Vegas, any casino on the Strip, and you'll see oral fixation. By the way, smoking and drinking together synergistically much worse for you than these things individual on public health cat on here. Drinking and smoking together much worse than either separately, and even just they really multiply the bad effects of each other. Anal phase refers to the time period between about the second year, between 18 and 36 months of life. During the stage, the baby deals with issues of linked to defecating or keeping feces inside and starts having a sense of independence. Back in the day, children were chastised for, not being able to control their bowels and these kind of things. But, we know now that this is a physiological thing, that the kids have to reach a certain physiological stage before they are able to control these things, right? And so if you do potty training too early, causes a kid a lot of frustration. And so this has to be timed just right. In adults, you'll see retentiveness. Used to call it anal retentiveness or excessive anal expulsiveness, which can also show up as excessive generosity, stubbornness, unrestrained ambivalence, obsessional behavior are expressions of this anal period of life. And I think later on in the class, you guys are going to read my paper on hoarding. And I talk a little bit about this with regard to hoarding, which, classically, this would be thought of as an anal phase thing, but, we take a little bit deeper than that. But this is sort of a hoarding, obsessional behavior, these kind of things. Clinical setting, we know the small anal issues where the patient may act symbolically to say, I will not move my bowels for you unless, or see, I move my bowels for you, or I would if I only could, please help me, almost like the patients are asking you to give them an enema in some way, and again, go back to that cathartic release thing, right? So that those therapies that rely on catharsis, if you're Freudian, hardcore Freudian, you're going to say, oh, you're dealing with people in the anal phase, they're able to let it all out, literally let the shit out, and then they'll feel better, right? But again, getting the underlying issue. Yes.
I was wondering if it's also like something like this where a kiddo will excessively go,
Mhm.
that are told not to, or doing it inappropriately.
Yeah. And you'll see this when they grow up, they'll have this excessive generosity, unrestrained, you'll see that as well. And then, you'll go in, if you ever do a home visit, you'll see their room will be just, disorganized. And of course, the extreme of that, could be like the really disorganized hoarding, Diogenes syndrome type of hoarding. But again, hoarding, and you'll read the paper, you'll see there's different types, there's organized and unorganized. So there's kind of, in a way, there's an anal retentive and an anal expressive type, right? Both with the compulsive stuff, right? It's very interesting. And those of you guys who have had kids, you'll know the stage is very interesting. My kid, luckily, he had a good child care person. She basically taught him all the stuff. She was so experienced at getting kids through the stage, just let her do it. She was fantastic. Really, but back in the day, people would chastise these kids for the stuff. Oh, and then didn't let it out and then punished, and that probably caused a lot of issues, right? Okay, case example, obsessional male patient provides a good example of issues stemming from this developmental stage. This patient would stay rather silent and talk about this or that or some event he'd read in the newspaper without any emotion. The impression that he gave was that he was like a child experiencing constipation, right? 5 or 10 minutes prior to ending the sessions, he would suddenly become very verbal and like emotional, and like this sort of emotional constipation would disappear, and he'd start telling me with excitement all about his dreams and a smile on his face as he left my office to be like just like the last few minutes, right? And this would make me feel like I was drenched in like his diarrhea, like just like diarrhea of the mouth, the last minute, right? Also, like he's holding everything until the last minute and then only doing it the last part of the session, right? So what is that? That is a resistance, right? So this is also a good form of resistance, right? See this kind of resistance. So this pattern of resistance, right? So of course this had to be addressed with it. Interesting at the end of the time, you're very silent, you're very just telling me these sort of surface level things until the very end, and suddenly all this stuff comes out. What's it's about? Explore that. So this is the kind of things you see, these kind of patterns. Now, the phallic edible phase, this is the most important, I think, in the Freudian lexicon here. And again, you guys know the story of Oedipus, the myth of Oedipus, right? So Oedipus was this guy, he was his parents, it was prophesied that he would someday kill his father. And so the father takes little baby Oedipus and puts him on a little basket in the river, and he goes down the river, get rid of him, he's going to drown. But somebody finds the basket, takes the baby, raises him, he doesn't know who he is. But he feels like all heroes, he has a great destiny. He goes to the city, but to get in the city, he has to go to the Sphinx. Sphinx is the gatekeeper of the city. And the Sphinx, and if you want to get in, go to the Sphinx, which is this lion creature with a woman's head and wings and a snake's tail. And you have to, the Sphinx will give you a riddle. And if you solve the riddle, you get to go into the great city. If you don't solve the riddle, the Sphinx, destroys you, eats you, whatever. Okay? So Oedipus goes to the Sphinx, and the Sphinx gives him a riddle. And the riddle is what first walks on 4 legs, then 4 legs, then 2 legs, then 3 legs. Okay, it's roughly paraphrasing the riddle, right? And what's the answer? Person, because a man, woman, person, right? Because at first you crawl on 4 legs, and you stand on 2 legs, and when you're old, you have to change to 3 legs, right? So Sphinx is pissed off, but he gets to let Oedipus in. Oedipus goes in. City gets into a thing with this. The king ends up killing the king, unknowing that the king is his father, and gets to marry his mother Jocasta, right? Marries his mother Jocasta. Long story short, yada yada yada. He finds out that she's his mother, and he is so upset about this that he pokes out his own eyes, and then he's taken off and lives out his days with his daughter. Interestingly enough, we can talk about that part. Daughter takes care of him until he's in his days. This is the myth that Freud bases this thing around, this Oedipal complex. The idea here is that there is a rivalry. We'll just talk about the male situation from the moment. The rivalry between the young boy, 3 to 5 years old, somewhere around in there, that he wants his mother. He wants his mother. He wants his mother sexually, but again, sexually doesn't mean genital sexually, because he doesn't have a real conception of that. Maybe starting to have an inkling of what that is, the difference between men and women. It's not like people misunderstand this, but the child, so it's almost like a love affair anymore. The child's in love with his mother, and the father is a rival, right? And again, if you have kids, I guarantee you'll see this in your kids. So I would come home from work, I'd see my wife, I'd go give her a hug and a kiss, and my kid is about 3 years old, and rush across the room, get right in between us and go, and push us apart, right? And later on, he'd say, oh, Mom, I want to marry you, very typical kind of thing, right? This typical Oedipal complex. And then what happens is that the kid is afraid that the father is going to realize this, the rival, and it's going to castrate him. That's the old school Freudian way of looking at it. The kid's going to be castrated. So this fear, because of the fear of castration, what the child ends up doing is realizing that he can't have mommy, and so what he does instead is he identifies with the father. And then the idea will be that he'll be able to get a woman like mommy later, right? This is how he resolves the Oedipal complex. So this is normal developmental pathway to the Oedipal complex, right? I told you guys my take on it already, that this is sort of a practice for being in a dominance hierarchy, in a primate dominance hierarchy. I'm going to write a paper on this, I swear to God. I'm going to call it dominance hierarchy confusion trademark, because I think from an evolutionary standpoint, it modernizes the way of looking at this. But I do think the way Freud talked about it is very, very, very accurate. And when I started doing therapy, I was amazed that this Oedipal complex, everybody had an Oedipal complex. It was amazing. It's just, like it was like a typical primate thing. Like, you see all your clients have some sort of Oedipal issue going on. It's just amazing to me. And so obviously this can have problems. Now, females have also an Oedipal complex. Used to be called the Electra complex. They, because after the story of Electra, which I won't go into, but you can imagine somewhat opposite of Oedipal story. Now everybody just calls it an Oedipal complex, whether it's male or female, pretty much. But females, it's a little bit different because what I have this on here? I should have included this on here. Females a little bit different. I talk about this in here. I should have included that slide. Little girls are also in love with their mother, but a little girl will notice, this is old school Freudian stuff, that she does not have a penis, which gives rise to her wanting to obtain one. And she develops what Freud termed was penis envy. Okay. And once she realizes the impossibility of attaining a penis, she transfers desire to obtaining a baby as a substitute. This is the very male perspective on this stuff. I'm going to give you the female perspective on this stuff, which is far more interesting, right? So let me come back to that because I don't want to skip over some of this other stuff. Okay. Again, so in male, again, there is at this stage, there is a growing awareness of the sexual organs. Male children, their drives start becoming centered around the penis, and female children linked to the clitoris, the vulva. This stage, children dress and undress and explore their genital areas. And again, this is another area where you can instill lots of moral anxiety in the kids. If they're playing with their parts a little bit, you can tell them how bad they are. And again, when they grow up, you will see the traces of this when they come to you for therapy. Another thing you will see, very, very common, unfortunately, especially if they came from a very religious family. Okay. I talked about the latter part of the phallic phase, the Oedipal complex already. Erotic interest in the opposite sex parents, sexual rivalry with the same sex parents appear and hopefully are resolved. Okay. Before I went a lot into this. I think I talked about all this stuff. It should be noted that most psychoanalytic clinicians do not ascribe special pathology to gay people regarding the resolution of the Oedipal phase. Another important thing. One idea is that boys have a predisposition to homosexuality because their biology may view their fathers as a primary erotic target and identify with their mothers. And for a nuanced and long overdue discussion of this, you should see Arthur Fox's paper, Gay-Friendly Psychoanalysis, The Abiding Pleasures of Prejudice. Again, there is some now beginning to be some acknowledgement that some homosexual behavior may stem from, especially early in utero exposure to different hormones in the brain, things like that. So again, we need to not be pathologizing this stuff. And so it's a very good paper. I would recommend, again, if we had a class just on Freud for the whole semester, I'd have you guys read that. Okay. Now, patterns are a bit different from girls. I mentioned this to you guys already. And again, we're modifying this now. Okay. And penis envy, I talk a little more about this, very controversial. The phenomenon that's been labeled as penis envy is extremely common. The standard reporting interpretation of the phenomenon is not really well liked. In fact, there have been several different interpretations of the penis envy phenomenon. For instance, feminist psychoanalysts interpret penis envy as little girls' growing awareness that she's denied the power and privilege given to males. No, she wants a penis. She wants to be treated, the same way like males get all this great treatment, right? And again, we can see this in society, quite obviously. Another interpretation of little girl envies the power of the mother to have the father's penis inside her. Some feminist psychoanalysts talk about this. The girl then wants to possess a penis or to satisfy the mother. It's a little pretzel logic on that one, Okay. A little weird. Psychoanalyst Karen Horney, in her paper titled On the Genesis of Castration Complex in Women, which she presented in 1922, and later published in a chapter in her book, Feminine Psychology, which, by the way, I highly recommend, delves the three causes of penis envy in girls. The first is envy over, that's what is termed urethral eroticism. This is the enjoyment boys get from producing a stream of urine to which are attached omnipotent and sadistic fantasies, right? And I don't know if any of you guys, when you were kids, when there was an anthill or something, you went and peed on it, I'm going to invade the ants with my pee, this kind of behavior, right? The second is envy of exhibitionism on the part of the little boy. He gets to display his genitals and even admire and hold them while he's taking a pee, right? For Horney, this jealousy of male exhibitionism is the root later cause of female display involving the whole body, including revealing clothing, makeup, jewelry, etc. So in other words, the little boy gets to pull out his penis and take a pee, right, out in front of everybody, whatever. The little girl, she touches herself, is shamed. She's told that's bad. You're not allowed, shouldn't do, you're not allowed to do this. You're doing bad, right? So this is this envy that the boys get to pull their junk out and do stuff with it, and the girls are not allowed to do this, right? And again, this is the last one, right? This is Karen Horner, by the way, smoking a cigarette, looking cool. She's a very interesting person. And this brings us this idea of womb envy. So let's be fair here, right? Talk about penis envy, or little girls want to have a penis. Wait a minute. Maybe little boys want to have a baby. You know, let's flip this around a little bit, right? So Karen Horney is the one who came up with this idea, though she did not label it as such. She saw and worked with this clinically, you know, and this is something she noticed among her patients. Okay? In other words, she's treating women as more than just men who do not possess penises. This is the Freudian, the old school Freudian view, that women are just men who don't have penises, right? Obviously, there's clearly a misunderstanding there, right? So Karen Horney is one of the people, and this is a younger Karen Horney, also with the birth school. This is Karen Horney is somebody who really turns this around. And I think you can start thinking of her as one of the pioneers of modernizing psychoanalytic thought. And she promotes a sort of equality of jealousy between the sexes, with both boys and girls having fantasies and desires for parental love and mutual envy for each other. I think this is really important. In a paper she wrote called The Dread of Women, originally published in 1932, and also included in her 67 books, she introduced the idea of womb envy, the counterpart to penis envy. She didn't use the term. The term came from a woman named Kay and also from Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, the first ones to actually apply the term womb envy to her idea. Basically, womb envy occurs when a boy realizes he does not possess the creative power of his mother. In other words, he can never have a baby. Freud himself alluded to the male desire to bear children or to have female genitals in his case subjects, Little Hounds, Dr. Schreiber, and the Wolfman, very interesting cases. Children are aware of and create unconscious fantasies around their mother's pregnancies. Child's fantasies about the mother's pregnancy is related to their unborn siblings and the possibility of losing their mother's love. My dad's also written about this. For the male child, however, the pregnant mother also brings awareness that he doesn't possess the creative power of the mother. This leads to Indian anger. As he grows older, this Indian anger takes the form of devaluing the feminine and evolves into misogyny. And this is one of the reasons that feminist psychoanalysts point out. This is one of the they believe underlying reasons why in society males have put women down, have women in their place. They don't make as much money, etc., etc., etc. You can think of all these kinds of things. They're not allowed in certain professions, at least they didn't used to be, etc., etc., etc. This all stems from women. And there's been some very, very, very good female psychoanalysts. Feminist psychoanalyst writing about this. Nancy Chodorow wrote about this in the Reproduction and Mothering book, Kay, 1984, and then Juliet Mitchell in 1974. Very, very good stuff. If you're into the feminist stuff, this is where feminism and psychoanalysis kind of come together in the writings of these folks. And they're really, really fantastic stuff. Highly, highly recommended. Nancy Chodorow, by the way, for you UCSC grads, used to teach at UCSC, and then she went off to Berkeley, hired famous. And anyway, very, very, very good stuff. There she is. That's Nancy. And her field was sociology, actually. It's very interesting. So again, you know, starting with Nancy, starting with Karen Horney, you also see, you know, the inclusion of more sort of like sociological, more outside things into the psychoanalytic theory, like the influence of outside things, you know, like actual real world stuff going on in society, impacting the person's psychology. So you see that starting with Karen Horney, and then and we continue with Nancy Chodorow and some of these other feminist psychoanalysts. Now, why I'm having such a lengthy, nuanced view of penis envy, because this is really important for psychotherapy. Okay? And I also think it's very important to redress the male-centric interpretation of this developmental stage. It's common in Freudian psychology. And also, there's a recognition that most psychotherapists now, psychotherapy professions, gone from being male to being female dominated. And this is, I don't know if you guys know this one, if you look around the class here, we have 3 guys and we have the rest of you are women. So when I was going through school, it was exactly opposite. There would have been mostly guys, and there would have been 3 women in the class, right? It's just a very short amount of time. I mean, I'm not that, I am old, but I mean, within my professional lifetime, this has occurred. You went from, 70% men, 30% women, to now it's about 70% women, 30% men. And, and there's actually people who've done some studies on this, right? And so again, I think we have to be looking at the female perspective, right? Because it's women who are going to be doing the most of the psychotherapy of the world. Okay, sorry guys, I mean that's just going to be the case, right? So mostly women are going to be in the profession, right? And unfortunately, you see all the proof of this womanly stuff in the profession, right? That the profession, since it's become female dominated, has lost status in this male dominated world, right? That's another thing that's occurred in psychology. Right? Very, very unfair. Very, very unfair. And you guys will notice this if you ever, I think be negative about choice of professions here, but you'll notice this when you go to get a job, working for somebody else, and you see how much you get paid compared to people in a more male-dominated profession, for instance, physicians, which now is also starting to become a little more equal. Physicians now, it's getting to be about 50-50. At least in the last 10, 20 years of medical students. When I was at Harvard, it was about 50-50. And I think that still holds pretty well. But you'll see, more male dominated in psychology, you'll see that, the pay rates are really quite significantly different. If you work in a hospital and you work alongside a physician, you'll be working with somebody who makes, significantly more money than you. They also may have significantly more debt. Maybe not because you're all going to Cal Lutheran, I don't know. But that is something you'll notice, and it's something that is not just a gender problem. It's not just because women are now predominantly in the profession. It's been going on for a long time. But I believe that the way women are treated in society monetarily is impacted the profession. I think it's unfortunate. I think you guys need to go out there and make waves to get paid better. And I really do. I think it's unfortunate thing about psychology in general. I think that we're considering the amount of level of education that we have that we don't get really paid super well. Now the exception to that is private practice. You can do pretty well in private practice still. So that's the exception. And probably most of you guys will end up in private practice, I guess. Is that anybody here planning on doing something besides private practice for your whole career? Think you're gonna do a little practice on the side, or you can just do all working for somebody?
Well, I wanted to do prison psychology.
Oh, prison psychology. Okay. Well, you'll never have a shortage of getting a job. There'll be lots of jobs, but then you'll realize that the people who are prison psychologists who then went on their own to be forensic psychologists make a tremendous amount more money. And I had a friend of mine who was a prison psychologist for a long time, and he went into private practice, and I couldn't believe how much money he was making. He worked in Tascadero State Prison for a long time. Charles Manson was one of his patients.
Wow.
He's in private. He always practiced, always running at 150%. So forensics is a good area, by the way. And unfortunately, we're not seeing any lessening of hardcore criminals out there. I mean, it goes up and down, but there's always some out there. So that's a good area. So I don't know. So anyway, you guys can. We'll be thinking about this. I'll be long retired. You guys will be thinking about this. Yeah, it's unfortunate. Okay, how are we doing on time? Okay, a few more minutes and I'll let you guys take a break. Oh, by the way, here I actually got data for you so you can see what this looks like here. So in 1980, about 50-50. This is I was a little before this. Well, this is about when I was getting good. 50-50. I thought it was more 70-30. They're saying 50-50. 1990, you can already see more women. Men have stayed relatively, gone up a little bit, but relatively constant. And the number of women is just like skyrocketing. You can see here, it's huge one. Okay, also this Oedipal phallic phase, we also can talk about the superego a little bit. This has to do with identification with parental figures. And this results in developing superegos and ego ideals. And the ego ideal is a counterpart of the superego. It's often not talked about when people talk about superego. So it's worth spending a few minutes. And Salman Akhtar, the author of your book, writes that the ego ideal extorts and pushes, striving to diminish the gap between the self as it is and as it is desired to be. The superego, in contrast, criticizes one for transgressing inner moral injunctions. Failure to meet superego demands causes guilt. Failure to approach the ego ideal's demand causes dejection and shame. Does that make sense? So the ego ideal is sort of like the best person you can possibly be. And if you don't reach that, you'll dejected and maybe a little ashamed. As opposed to the superego, the other part of the superego is makes you feel guilty, right? You're just bad, so you feel guilty, right? So those are the two aspects of the superego. Clinical setting, we notice that the phallic step of Freudian developmental stage is when our patients become interested in the clinician's genital organ and desire to own it, right? So the other more general way to say that is when the clients, when the patients start becoming interested in your sexuality in the clinical setting, this can have something to do with this. Also, I would say another aspect of this that you may notice, especially if you see long-term patients, is that you will see them sometimes, starting to express an interest in becoming a psychologist, right? And this can be partly related to superego ideal, right? They're super. Maybe if they came in, the superego ideal wasn't really good, going on the superego, but they start resolving this. And then, you become a good model for their ideal. You'll see patients and sometimes asking you about, becoming a psychologist. Very, very, I wouldn't say common, but I would say not uncommon, right? And this is something where in the past, I'll admit this, I have broken neutrality a little bit. I had a patient who was really at the end of her therapy. She was had done very well, saw her for a couple of years, very, very well. And near the end, started asking me about like psychology, what it was like to be trained as a psychologist. Questions started out kind of general first and became more and more specific, like, where should I go to school? What should I do? And this is an area where I thought she was almost done with her therapy. She was ready to terminate. And might have actually already been in the termination phase. And I just said, okay, I'm going to lay it out to you. This is, where you should go. This is what you should be thinking about. If you want to go I should go to school that's APA approved program, even though the APA is a horrible organization, on and on. I gave her my whole rap, right, that I give my graduate students now. And then she went on to become a psychologist. You'll see that sometime. And you'll see in the history of psychoanalysis, there's a lot of this, right? So, Jung, patient Sabina Spielren, who we ended up sleeping with, she ends up becoming a psychoanalyst in her own right. A number of these patients, you see throughout history of psychoanalysis, people who started out by going into therapy and then they become really enamored of it. And so part of this may be taking on the therapist as an ego ideal. And I translate this, you become interested in the clinician's genital organ. I take this a little broadly and say, become interested in the clinician as an ego ideal, right? And so again, at some point, you become a role model. It almost becomes a Van Durian sort of a thing. You become almost like you're doing modeling for especially at the end, especially in the transition, at the termination phase, when the person is transitioning out of therapy. I don't know if anybody's written about this or not, but that's an interesting area to be thinking about. Somebody ought to actually write about that a little bit. I think that'd be really quite fascinating. Could be a good dissertation topic. I don't know. Yeah. Okay, clinical manifestations. Male patient will walk into the office as if his body was an erect penis. Also, as a female patient who spent many hours fantasizing about marrying the therapist and imagining the size of his penis. You put somebody in the couch and you don't sit in front of them. This kind of stuff will start coming out. Clinician is female. The patient may be preoccupied with the clinician's ability to bear children or capture a penis. I have seen this quite a lot where in female clinicians that the clients, the patients will become very interested in whether the therapist female therapist has children or whether she's married, has a husband, you'll see questions. They'll ask you questions about that. I don't know if anybody of you experienced that. Any of your patients asking you, whether you're married or have a boyfriend or, you have kids or not. You'll see some of this sometime. Okay. Arrogance, exaggerated self-confidence, or an opposite psychic state, such as having easily injured vanity, are linked to this sort of phallic stage, this genital phase. And you can be on the outlook of that. Oedipal pathology may cause a man's preoccupation with competition with another man, usually an older one. You'll see this out all the time. You'll also see this with females now. With women, not just men anymore. Adulthood, extreme jealousy, fear of authority figures, fear of intimacy, anxiety while having sex, searching for unsuitable partners, such as a much older person. Some sexual deviations are connected with Oedipal issues. Everything you'll see, these is so common. So common. You'll see these kind of things all over the place. So, I'll be curious if after talk to you about this stuff, if you go back and start looking at your patients and certainly start seeing the Oedipal complex. So I'll be curious. You guys have to tell me if you become aware of this and starts becoming really obvious. Yes.
But like the last paragraph just screams them because they tell me that they only date men that are like 20, 30 years older than them.
Yeah. Yep.
And they have like the fear of intimacy and there's extreme jealousy.
Yep. Very typical. You'll see this quite a lot, and you'll see the opposite. You'll see women who want younger guys, all Oedipal stuff, just tons of this stuff. So again, I think you see it so much that it makes me think there's a biological substrate to this, which I'm going to harp on. Yes.
Does that person have to be raised in the traditional parent household where there's two parents?
Nope, not at all.
Okay.
Not at all.
How would that form if somebody was raised by like a single parent or was raised in multiple homes or there wasn't like the
So this is an area that needs more research. But typically what will happen is that it used to be thought, oh, you're raised by a single mother, you're gonna, you won't go through the Oedipal complex correctly because your father's not around, so you've won the Oedipal complex, and so you'll identify with your mother, you'll become gay. That was one of the older theories. What happens is that kids actually are pretty resilient. So, I was raised by a single mother. And so in my life, I had a number of people who were, and I didn't see my dad for a long time when I was growing up. I had a number of other father figures that were teachers and people I worked with and people around that, I took on father roles for me. And so that's how you work it out. Now, do I still have Oedipal issues? Probably, I will not do too great with authority. Okay, I'm all right. I get along with the dean here, pretty well. Probably better than some people, but you find substitutes. Likewise, if you have, two same-sex parents, one may take on a father role, one may take on another role for you. Or you may find substitutes outside, right, that do that. So kids are fairly resilient, right? Or you could have a traditional family, mother, father, and a kid, and there could be all sorts of screw up things going on. Part of it has to do with your own resilience as a person. Everybody has differing levels of resilience, and you'll see this in your patients. Some patients have horrendous childhoods, and they've turned out pretty well put together, right? And some will have, looks on the outside really fantastic childhoods, and they'll be really screwed up. So there's a lot of individual variation here, right? You got to take that into account. But generally you'll find, people will figure out some sort of substitute for these things, and you can think about that. You see that kind of thing happening. So just because somebody, I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that because they had a certain family constellation that was going to cause the Oedipal problem. What actually the relationship with those family members or with those substitute family members, that's what's really going to tell you, the quality of that's going to tell you about the Oedipal complex. Okay? That's what I would say. All right. Okay. Almost at the end of this, I'm going to let you go. And I talked to you about my evolutionary view of looking at this thing already, so I won't go over that again. But really, this has to do with being in dominance hierarchy. So one way you can look at it, this is what I do now. I'll just acknowledge this to you guys. Rather than look at the sort of traditional Freudian way of looking at Oedipal complex, I just look at it as people trying to fit into dominance hierarchies. So your first dominance hierarchy is in your family with your mother and your father. You know, you're having to deal with an alpha male and alpha female, how you position yourself among them, rivalry for the female, rivalry for the male, right? It's your practice session. Then you get to sort of the latency stage, you go to school, and now you're in the first dominance hierarchy with other people from society. And if you had a good practice session with your parents, you'll do okay in the school. You'll figure that out where you belong in the dominance hierarchy. If that works out okay, by the time you get to adolescence, you'll get more into society as a whole. You know, you'll be able to figure out your place in the dominance hierarchy. And if you don't figure out your place in the dominance hierarchy, you become very neurotic, right? Now, who was the pioneer to show this? You know, show this in an empirical way. Who's the great psychologist pioneer who shows this in an empirical way? You can go on TV any time of the day, go on YouTube, search for and look at this. Who? No, not Dr. Phil. Dr. Phil, the opposite. Dr. Phil, you will see what you should not do. Now watch Dr. Phil. Whatever Dr. Phil does, don't do that. And you'll be fine. Sorry, Dr. Phil. He's not doing any sort of therapy at all. He's doing a lot of advice giving, a lot of judgmental, a lot of white middle class values being foisted on people. No, right? Not saying everything he says is bad, but that's not right. No, first thing you want to see is Caesar Milan. You know who Caesar Milan is? He's the dog guy, right? He goes and finds some dog, it's running around the backyard, chasing its tail, biting itself, biting anybody who comes over to it. They go, that dog does not know where it belongs in the dominant side. And what he'll do is he'll go to that dog, he'll establish he's the dominant animal. The dog will calm down. Oh, he's the dominant. I know my place now. Dog calms down. And then what he does is he takes the dog out. Now we're going to go out. And he has a whole pack of dogs, his own dog. And he brings that dog into his pack. That dog then figures out with the whole group of dogs where it belongs. And they're all happy and running off, you know, together. And that's exactly what we do with humans and with therapists and we do psychotherapy and we look at the complex. It's almost the same kind of, that's how I look at it. I may be overly simplistic, right? Not all the dogs get better right away, but a lot of them do. You can see it within the span of the TV show, right? That these dogs are finding their place. They have dominance, hierarchy, confusion. They don't know where they belong. Now, dogs, it's easier because they only really have one hierarchy they're really in, right? Their family with their owner, right? And maybe some other dog, right? Dogs pretty easy. The problem for humans is that we are in 50 different dominance hierarchies, right? Which is way more than we evolved to deal with. We probably evolved to deal with maybe 3 or 4. But we're in like 50. You're in one now in this classroom, there's another one in another classroom, there's another one at work, there's another one with your family, another one when you go to the beach, you know. Every time we do whatever hobby you're into, there's another one. We have too many of them and we become confused. We don't know where we belong in the dominance hierarchy. And that's where we get all this neurotic stuff. We don't know how we should compete, where we should compete, how much, you know, how much competition should we have? And it becomes really confusing for us. And so one way I look at the Oedipal complex is that we're going to help people to figure out ways to help them understand where they are in the dominance hierarchy. Okay, where's their natural place in the dominance hierarchy where they feel the most comfortable. Okay? And this is how I look at it. And again, you know, Freud talked about love and work, right? These are the main things. And again, you know, in your relationship, there's rivalry in relationships, there's rivalry in work situations. And so how do you deal with this competition and rivalry, right? How do you deal with it? And so this is something that you didn't get from your parents properly when you were young. And so now you're going to go get it from your therapist. And you're going to get it via the transference. This is how you're going to understand how you exist in the dominance hierarchy is by resolving that transference with your therapist, who is going to be a proper person there, a neutral person who's going to, you know, basically you're going to have a corrected emotional experience with, and that's going to clue you into how you fit in the dominance hierarchies. That's my take on all this stuff, my evolutionary bent to all this stuff. Okay? And I'm going to write about it. Don't steal my idea. If somebody wanted to do a dissertation on this, I'd be more than happy to work with you. But I think this is the way I'm looking at this stuff. Take it with a grain of salt. Okay, so again, you can look at this diagram here. You know, that again, what's important about this is that, you know, we start here, you know, with this sort of dyadic phase, right? This is the early developmental levels. And then we move up to this level where there's a mother and a father. This is sort of the Oedipal phase. And then this gets elaborated out to societal things, right? There's lots of other people besides the mother and father, right? And you learn how to deal with them. Mhm. So again, this is the practice finding one's place in the larger hierarchy outside of the family. And this, of course, would have to do with competing for a mate, right? At least traditionally, that would be why this system confers fitness, because it helps you compete for a mate. Sorry, there's a typo there. Yeah, so I'm going to write about this one of these days. All right, I think that's all I'm going to say about that. Don't steal my idea. I put a trademark on it already. There's Caesar Milan and his dogs. There he is, and they figured it out, you know. He's a good psychologist, good behavioral psychologist, by the way. And he doesn't do any of this stuff. No psychoanalysis with him. It's all behavior. It's all behaviorism, but it's also not behaviorism with the idea that the mind is a blank slate, that there actually are pre-programmed things that are programmed from evolution, you know, patterns of behavior that have had fitness, confer fitness to certain animals over their evolutionary path. He takes advantage of that and then applies behaviorism, which is pretty brilliant, actually. I think he's pretty, I'd love to meet him. I think he's one of the most, definitely if you're looking for TV psychologists, I think he's the best. I challenge you to tell me a better TV psychologist than Caesar Milan. You know, I would do a TV show. Hey, if you know anybody, I'd do a TV show and I would have Caesar Milan and me, and we would go and we would take his thing, we do with humans. That's I don't know where we do it. I'd probably lose my license, but we'd figure out a place to do it. Sketchy country somewhere. We would do this with humans. We would do the same, apply his ideas to human beings, right? See how they work. You know anybody? I can convince John Kroll to do it, so I talked to him about it. All right. Latency phase is where Oedipal issues enter the child. Like I said, this is where all the stuff kind of calms down for a time, and the child really spends their energy learning the culture of the society. So again, if you're in a traditional society, we learn how to do bow and arrow. If you're in a modern society, you learn code. It becomes more and more important. Coding has become now part of the technology that kids need to learn. So this is what you do in this stage, right? Very important. And then the genital phase, you know, adolescent passage, onset of puberty, male becomes aware he has a penis, and it's not just part of the body for peeing. And, you know, you can get girls pregnant, all that kind of stuff. Girls invest in their vaginas and the maturation of their breasts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The secondary sexual characteristics become very important. Anna Freud talked about this, focused on how physiological endocrinological changes in the body reawaken all the earlier issues from the earlier developmental stages. Okay. And she also talked about how going through an adolescent passage provides a model for adult type mourning. Youngster reviews the images of their childhood, modifying some while discarding others and gaining new ones. Parents may recognize this type of mourning, for instance, when their older college-age children wistfully reminisce about their childhood or derive bittersweet enjoyment from looking through photographs of their childhood years. I don't know if any of you have done this, but I have a college-age kid right now. He's almost 20, and he does a lot of this. Really interesting. Like they'll look through old child pictures, and go, oh yeah, I remember that, and kind of wistfully think about the stuff. It's really interesting. So I was reading this, you know, getting ready to flex on. I said, how do he does this? Still doing this kind of stuff, you know. So now I'll Zoom with him and I'll show him pictures, you know, because on my TV I have screensavers like from the photo album, you know, and so pictures will come up while I'm talking to them and be like, oh yeah, look at this picture, and I'll show it to them. Like, oh, you know, it's wistfulness. It's kind of interesting. Something I would have never thought of. But you will see it. Okay. That's all I want to say about this. I don't know if I'm going to talk about Erickson's levels because it's not quite as relevant to this class and we don't have a tremendous amount of time. All right. So here's a little chart here that shows the different stage thinking. And you can have your cognitive stages here, Piaget, moral development here, Kohlberg. Mahler, very important, especially Mahler. What Mahler is a psychoanalytic thinker who actually based a lot of the stuff on observation of infants. And she she actually breaks down the early stages into 30 sub-phases. And these are very important for the object relation stuff we're going to talk about a little bit later. And she is very, very influential, Margaret Mahler, very influential on most of the object relations theorists. So we'll try to get a little more into these a bit later. These are pretty important. And we'll talk about object relations. I'm putting that lecture together. I'm going to put some of the stuff in there. And then Erickson, you guys know about Erickson's view. He takes the Freudian stages and sort of widens them out to also deal with psychosocial development. So it's not just internal psychology, but it's psychosocial, how the person interacts with not just with themselves, but with society. And, you know, the oral phase is trust and mistrust, and then, you know, autonomy, shame and doubt, and Oedipal is initiative versus guilt, latency is industry inferiority. And when you go into the adult years, genital is identity role confusion, then intimacy, isolation, generativity and stagnation, ego, integrity, and despair. And then he even had one that he came up with before he died, having to do with sort of life review kind of things. My dad's a friend of Erickson's, so he knew Erickson very, very well. And brilliant guy, never finished, got his doctoral degree or anything like you guys are doing. And you guys know about Piaget and Kohlberg, right? I don't need to go over these with you guys. I assume, right? Yeah. Okay. Were all you guys psychology majors as undergraduates? Yeah, me neither. So it's interesting. Yeah. Okay. All right. So when we talk about let's talk a little bit about these Mahler stages that I just mentioned. We consider severe psychopathology. It's really useful to look at early developmental stages with more specificity. This is where we're going to find the origins, the genesis of personality disorders, right? So Mahler wrote in 1958, 1968 about these stages. And her books are really, really good. I recommend it. These are some Human Symbiosis, Vicissitudes of Individuation, 1968. Very, very good book. She wrote what's called the normal autistic phase. And by autistic, they don't mean autistic syndrome. It's not a diagnosis. They mean autistic in the sense that the person is self-referential. That's what this means. And if I were the king of the world, I would change anytime I saw autistic and these things to self-referential. I would say normal self-referential phase instead of autistic. But people get confused. No, it's not autistic disorder, right? People used to think that autism was one of these kind of things that were psychologically incurred. It was not part of the brain like it is now. And so there was a lot of confusion back in the day. We can have a whole talk about that, which we won't, because it's a little confusing. Maybe we know a little bit. But this first stage suggests that from birth to 10 or 12 weeks of age, very early, infant is self-absorbed, does not have a sense that satisfaction of her needs come from external sources, at least not most of the satisfaction. Right? So they're autistic in the sense that they're just self-referential. When new findings illustrated that a newborn infant's mind is more active than we thought, earlier, a new name was given to this phase and they started calling it quasi-autistic, because we do know that the child has some awareness of the outside, just, mostly self-referential. Please note that the use of the term autistic here is not the same meaning the diagnosis of autistic spectrum disorder. Very important. The next stage is the normal symbiotic phase. Stage starts in the last part of this stage and lasts about 4 to 5 months of life. Infant is merged with the mother, and he or she doesn't have a separate sense of individuality really than with the mother, right? They're sort of fused with the mother. And you'll see this in even very small infants, like people will walk around the room, come into the room, infants will just completely ignore them. Mom walks in the room, they'll suddenly, pay attention. They'll recognize the mother. There's a lot of merging with the mother, the feelings with the mother, not a lot of separate sense of identity, right? A little bit later on, the child goes into separation individuation phase. The child moves out of the symbiotic union with his mother into 4 subphases. Okay, so these subphases are under this phase. I should have indicated this a little bit, sorry. And the first one is the differentiation subphase. Exists from about 4 or 5 to 9 or 10 months, during which the infant's awareness of the mother in general the world keeps increasing. The practicing subphase from 9 or 10 to 15 or 16 months, when the increased psychomotor ability, the infant experiences physical separation from his primary objects, the mother or other mothering persons. The infant also needs emotional refueling by running back to the primary object and touching her before experiencing another physical separation. So Freud wrote about this phase in the case of little Hans. Little Hans, this little boy, he would want to, the kids want to be separate from the mother, they want to be independent and run away. The kid will run away, run away from the parents. I get a certain point, with that, if mom's still there, mom's still there, run back to mom, right? Let's see what this is. Very, very common, right? This is this practicing subphase. Rapprochement subphase, 15 to 16 months to 24 months. It was clear for the baby that he or she cannot control the mother. They have separation anxiety surfaces. The child experiences ambivalence, helplessness, and temper tantrums. So this is the terrible twos you've heard of. The child will, start having separation anxiety, right? The mother leaves the room, the child will suddenly become become really anxious. They'll throw tantrums. They're also they still want to they want to express their independence. They start wanting to express their independence, but the anxiety and the separation, the ambivalence will show up in these tantrums. The next phase is object constancy. Successful completion of the third subphase marks the development of a steady internal mental image of important objects, such as an image of the mother. When the child is not with the mother, he or she is with her an intrapsychic image. The process accompanied by the child's development of more realistic self-representation, not fused with the mother's intrapsychic image. So this phase is very important. This means that even though the mother is not there, the child has an internal image of the mother. In other words, the mother is stable enough in the child's mind that the child will think that the mother will come back. The mother's not gone. Before that, when the mother's gone, it's as if the mother is dead. The mother doesn't exist anymore. And that's what caused the child all this anxiety. By the object constancy stage, the mother can be gone, but the child still knows that the mother is there for them. It's sort of an inner psychic image, an internalizing image. And this is the stage where really the sense of self starts to really crystallize, sense of individual identity, or in the term of your book, the identity becomes less diffused, becomes a little bit more established. A very important stage to reach is object constancy. And this is something you'll see in therapy if your client, your patient, has not had problems in this object constancy subphase. You'll see, again, they'll start acting out, right? They'll have temper tantrums, they'll feel helpless, they'll have separation anxiety, these kind of things when you're not there. When once you've taken on transference, establishes itself, it will be this kind of thing going on here. Okay. And again, this is something you will see with personality disorder clients, because this is, again, this is the subphase in which a lot of personality disorders sort of, start happening when there was problems in these phases here. Okay? And this is something you'll see with personality disorder people. Now, when a psychoanalyst or psychoanalytic psychotherapist meets someone who's seeking treatment, the diagnosis of a person's personality organization is necessary. Specific types of personality organization play a role in the clinical manifestations of the transference and it becoming hot and being included in the working through of mental conflicts and repairing ego deficits. Personality organizations produce some common transference as well as countertransference responses. For example, neurotic individuals are primarily focused on issues dealing with the Oedipal conflict and defenses and resistances related to such issues. A person with exaggerated narcissism from the beginning of his or her treatment may perceive themselves as grandiose while devaluing the therapist. That's the fun of working with narcissists. Another individual with exaggerated narcissism might idealize the therapist along with the idealization of himself or herself while constantly devaluing the other object. So this is something when you do therapy with narcissists, you have to be aware of this kind of thing. There's certain techniques and strategies for that. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. The diagnosis of a personality organization is made by assessing the nature of the patient's self and object images rather than just simply referring to symptoms or character traits. By taking into consideration two ego functions, differentiation and integration. Okay, and these need to be distinguished from things that we call encapsulation and externalization. Okay, so let's describe what these are. Encapsulation, externalization first. Encapsulation describes separating and isolating a traumatized self-image with its corresponding object images and affects and a part of itself, which is a reservoir of tasks given to them by traumatized people from previous generations. Okay, this is from the rest of self-representation. In other words, the person is encapsulation is, in a sense, splits the traumatized part of their self-representation and the corresponding object images, the internalized, images of their parents apart, right? They keep the trauma encapsulated, right? So this is kind of like, you get a brain infection, like a cyst or something, you get like a worm in your brain, and your brain will build a little thing, a cyst around the worm to keep it separate from the rest of the brain. This is what happens in some, I won't show you pictures of this stuff, but it's pretty gross. But this is the body encapsulated. You get a splinter. Let's take a splinter, right? Your body will build something around it and push it out, right? This is the same, mentally kind of the same thing. Your body, your mind will sort of encapsulate the traumatized part of the self-image and sort of keep it away from the other self-representations. This may be what happens with people who claim alien abduction. Again, this would be a great dissertation topic for somebody who wanted to write about encapsulation and alien abduction. I would love to be on that dissertation. So it's a kind of a splitting process, but not exactly like the dissociation of the splitting defense. A little bit, but more like you've encapsulated this bad part and kind of keeping it off over here. Okay, that makes sense. And then there's an externalizing part of this, which is externalizing aspects of oneself into another person or to the external world. And this is similar to the projective identification that we talked about before, right? You guys all remember projective identification? Okay. So here's an example, patient named Arnold under the influence of the unconscious fantasy of entering his mother's belly and killing his unborn sibling. This is his fantasy. What he does, he becomes a cave explorer, a spelunker, as it's known. Not finding his sibling in the caves, Arnold enters them again and again and again in various locations. In other words, this safeguarded him from his psychic reality that he might be a murderer. So he has this fantasy that he murdered his unborn sibling. And so what happens is he externalizes this into the world, and he goes and he actually spends time going into these caves. He's concretized this into some kind of cave exploration thing, right? He's taken this symbolic thing. Okay. Unfortunately, what happened with him is after safely exploring his cage, he would function as a normal individual. Okay. But after some time elapsed, he'd have to repeat the exploration of the same or another cave so he could feel normal again. In this sense, now he visited his encapsulated, traumatized self with its own wishes and defenses, as well as the traumatizing object, the sibling in his mother's belly. The rest of the time, however, he was normal, since the traumatizing object did not appear in the caves he explored. So this is a way of this encapsulation and externalization can become a form of acting out. So in this case, acting out by going to these caves. The encapsulation breaks down, the rest of the individual's self system will be assaulted by the previous encapsulated part of the individual experience anxiety and confusion. In other words, if he doesn't go to the caves, that traumatic part will break down, and then the feelings of him being a murderer of his sibling will rise up and cause all sorts of problems. Now, unfortunately for this case, it's a very interesting case. Arnold is going to one of these caves and actually goes into a cave and he actually finds a dead body, right? He actually finds the symbolic dead sibling in the cave, reinforcing this idea that he killed the sibling. And of course, he breaks down, and that's what leads him to go into therapy, and he has to be hospitalized, became anxious, depressed, and paranoid, had to be hospitalized for a little while. Okay? So again, when you see this acting out, it's a symbolic, they're acting out in a literal way, some sort of symbolic thing going on, some mental symbolic thing. So let's talk about differentiation, integration, developmental splitting, defensive splitting. A person who cannot go through separation and individuation phases in a normal fashion as an adult will have difficulty in testing reality and knowing and sensing how different objects have their own boundaries. Till a child can tolerate ambivalence, there's normal developmental splitting of self and object images. So that splitting defense you see in borderline personality disorder people, that actually is a normal developmental level. That happens in normal development. In other words, we all did that at normal development level. We kept the good and the bad split. And then over time, what happens is we were able to then sort of infuse those images together. They become ambivalent when you see the mothering person initially as both good and bad, hopefully mostly good and a little bit bad, right? But we all go through a level where those things are split off, okay? So that's a normal thing that happens. Okay, but if you don't get past that level, then you never integrate those good and bad images. That's where later on as an adult you need to keep those things good and bad, and the splitting defense comes into play. Okay. And I wrote you a nice diagram because this is complicated stuff, and it's like, probably you're probably all having brain salad right now thinking about this stuff. So you can kind of think about this stuff. You have this person here, the infant here, right? And here they are. Their environment is the parent. Just consider one parent really at this point, the mothering person, whoever that is. This image becomes internalized and becomes what we call an object representation. Okay, this is confusing in the literature because sometimes people will call this an object representation, and sometimes it will be referred to just as an object, right? And know from the context, you'll know it's a representation. I like to be specific about it and say this is a mental representation of this object. This is the object out there. Okay? Object representation, mental representation, and then they'll have some kind of self-representation. In other words, these mental representations of the parents, of the parenting, the mothering person, and then sort of the sense of their own agency will start to combine in the form of self-representation, right? And then these will relate to each other in here, right? And eventually these will all coalesce into a sense of self. We can call it a self-object. Again, there's a little confusion about the language in this in psychoanalysis. Somebody really needs to clean this up. Self or self-object, will coalesce into this, and this will be this ambivalent thing. We'll have the images of the parents, the good and bad, together, along with their own sense of agency together. This will be kind of the self, right? Now, if something goes wrong here, like this object representation is all bad, the parents, mostly aggressive, negative stuff here, then this can be projected out onto the real world out here. Right? That's why they get rid of it. So when you become an adult, this becomes a defensive mechanism. Okay. Or this can be, you have multiple object representations, you have good images from the parents, bad images. These things never coalesce, they never become ambivalent, come together, they stay separate. This is the borderline personality disorder person. Then when they become an adult, they will either try to project out the bad and keep the good, or they will be all bad and they'll project out the good. They'll have that splitting defense going on, right? Or they'll do projective identification. They'll project the bad out and make this person become the bad object. Okay, so that clues you in when you're seeing somebody like that. If they're making you into this bad person where you hate them and you have all the feelings of bad, or making you into their parent. From that age, right? On here. So this is just kind of a simple diagram. I mean, it's not really super complete. That makes sense though. Like getting this across a little bit. This is something that, again, if we had a whole semester just on this stuff. Like I took a class when I was a doctoral student, we had a whole semester just on this. I mean, we literally read like, 500 pages a week. I mean, it was a really intensive class. And we just sat around and talked about it. So we didn't even teacher didn't even have diagrams. We just talked about it, right? I like the diagrams. The diagrams really help me with the diagrams. But we could have a whole semester just on this stuff. So this is whole object relations theory. Maybe I can convince the dean to let me do a course on this if enough people are interested. You're going to kind of get a lot of the stuff because this is class on personality disorders, and this is the stuff in the Freudian world that most directly applies to working with people with personality disorders. So I'm going to give you a lot of the stuff. I'll be referring back to this, but I want to give you a general idea of this first, okay? Another way you can look at it, I didn't make up these slides. I got these from someplace. They're not perfect, but again, same idea here, like primary significant others, internalized messages and affects, right? So a lot of the stuff is images that these kids are internalized. I don't mean like a visual image. They're also feeling states. They're also emotional states, right? Remember I said psychodynamic psychology is not cognitive behavioral, it's emotional cognitive behavioral, right? So this is where the emotional stuff is coming in, the feeling states, right? And then, the kid develops its ego. And again, there's a little confusion in the literature between the ego and the sense of self, right? And one way I like to think about it is the ego is really is really the person sitting behind the steering wheel, driving the car, making decisions about whether it should stop at the stop sign or not. It's really the executive functioning of that. One way you can think of it is the cognitive executive functioning of that sense of self. It's that part of the sense of self. That's the cognitive executive function, the person driving the wheel. And that's a perfect analogy. The literature is another area where the literature can be less confusing. Okay. Here, and this is the early years and the later years, there's the self-image here has internalized messages, affects related to prior significant others, all here, all put together, hopefully for the old person, put together nice ambivalently. And this generates expectations about relationships with people in the outside world. In other words, we relate to people in the outside world in the way that we were able to, that has to do with how we internalize emotions and messages and things from our significant others when we were small children. And again, this is a really fancy way of saying transference. Okay? Countertransference, transference. Okay? In other words, this is the original relationship, and now this is the transferential relationship later in our life. Okay, so finally we get to the thing, I already mentioned this to you before, 4 personality organizations. So all this stuff leads up to 4 personality organizations. And these are neurotic personality organizations, which encompasses normal people. Freud said we're all neurotic to some degree. Some people might be more severely neurotic and need therapy, and other people may just be regular neurotic and still need therapy because it's a good thing to do just to get to know yourself. But that's the highest level, the more knowledge level. Then you have narcissistic personality organization, where you do have some identity stability, because the sense of self revolves around the narcissistic core, the narcissistic self. I'm going to go into some detail about that. It's quite interesting. I find that very fascinating. Then you have borderline personality organization, where you have the split, ambivalent, because the objects never really became ambivalent. And then you have the psychotic personality organization, where things are very fragmented. Okay, and these levels differ in maturity. The level of identity integration, which you're reading in your book now, your book talks a lot about this, and the capacity for reality testing, ego function. Okay? That the ego function is okay and needs to, and then really is a little bit messed up, and you get borderline, and then it's super messed up in psychotic personality organization. And again, you can think of all things that go into this, biology, cultural stuff, individual differences, personal origins, interface between self and others, all this kind of things, neurobiology, all these things play into these levels. Okay. Time. Oh my God, we're gonna run out of time. I want to save some time to do the papers. Let's not love to go through. So again, you can also think about the stuff in terms of like the big 5, openness, conscientious, extroversion, neuroticism. This is like the standard personality test. So you can think about these things in terms of these things if you want. Not super important for this class, but just so that you know that it's there. Here's another way you can look at this stuff. I'll let you guys look through some of this stuff on your own. And again, here's another diagram here. You can look through this. Okay. I like these diagrams. I find these to be helpful, help me understand these things. These are actually putting personality disorders into these sort of organizations here. And this breaks down borderline personality organization into high and low, right? So it's kind of high, borderline might be more like narcissistic, think of it that way. Okay, more of the stuff. Just let you guys look at this kind of stuff here. I'll let you look at this on your own. Kernberg has a dimensional model. Otto Kernberg, very important person. Again, I think I put the book up on the Canvas site if you want to read his book. Highly recommend it.